absolutely delighted to share with you this afternoon an opportunity to meet with Gary Mangiofico, who, as I've said to you in my emails, is just one of the most well-read, intelligent, well-spoken. Just he's someone that I think everybody should have the opportunity to meet somewhere in their lives. So today we are not going to have a small group conversation. I'm just checking, for some reason I'm getting a bit of a echo on my. No. Gary, I'm going to just unmute you just now. So so we're not going to start. Normally when we have these sessions, we start with a small group conversation. This is just an hour conversation, so we want to make the most of it. So therefore, I want to just ask you if you could, in the chat function, to share with us, why did you decide to show up today? So I've put a few people on the spot. Justin and Grant told us, but just to get a sense of your thoughts, and then Gary can read it while I tell you a quick story about how it is that we are where we are today. How did this all come about? So story time. So Gary and I met when the Masters of the Science of OD Alumni Conference was held in Cincinnati with Peter Block many years ago. Peter asked me to join, and Gary was there, obviously. And for those of you who may not know, the Masters of the Science of OD course, it's a postgraduate course, is one of the most well-known, but I think also most celebrated OD degrees that you can do. So it's always been, you know, I've always, one day when I grow up, I'm going to do the OD program at Pepperdine University. It's not going to happen, but that was where this all came from. Someone recently described Gary as the worldwide or the global CEO of OD. If there was such a thing, he would be it. But both Gary and I both became Peter Block Fellows. We attended a series of wonderful intergenerational wisdom sharing sessions with Peter Block, Angeles Arian, and other fabulous people. And so that happened before 2010. I then got very busy with setting up Partners for Possibility in South Africa and kind of lost contact with a whole bunch of people. And then years ago, I had the opportunity to attend the Thinkers 50 conference in the UK. And Tom Peters was there. And Tom Peters was just raving. He was so excited when he heard what we were doing, because he's been saying for years and years and years that we need to rethink executive development, leadership development, management development, that what's happening, what has been happening is just not working for the world that we're going into. The reality is that we've been too busy to do anything about it. So earlier this year, I was at a conference and Santiago Rincon Gallardo was there, and he spoke about what is happening in the global south as something that people in the global north should get interested in. He said there's just way too much innovation and just interesting things happening. He specifically talked about social movements and education, but he said it's time for the global north to learn from the global south. So this was the second time that I heard this idea, the global north learning from the global south, which is what Tom Peters was talking about as well. So earlier this year, Gary made contact because they wanted to bring a group of MSOD students to South Africa. And obviously because of COVID, it didn't happen, but it kind of reconnected me with Gary. So when we published the new Partners for Possibility book, and I started to ask people for endorsements, Phil Mervis gave us an endorsement, but I reached out to Gary and said, would you be willing to give us an endorsement? And he gave us a beautiful endorsement. And I just knew in that moment that we need to make more of this. So anyway, that happened earlier this year, and then the book got published. We've been doing these virtual book launches, and they've all been specifically about education and the impact on education. And I knew at the back of my mind we needed to do something about Partners for Possibility as a leadership development program, but we just didn't get there. And then Julian Birkinshaw published an article on rethinking management education for a virtual world. So Julian is professor at London Business School. He's the professor of strategy and entrepreneurship at the London Business School. And that article just really triggered me, and I will share that article at some point. But it made me realize that we could do something interesting with being in conversations with people like Julian and Gary and other people that I have in my network. So that's how this Reimagine Leadership Development series of conversation was born. So last week, we had 4 business leaders who shared their experience of being part of Partners Possibility and the impact that this has had on them. And one of them is Grant Kelly that you heard from just now. This afternoon, we're talking to Gary. Next week, we have a conversation with Julian Birkinshaw. I do hope that the next conversation after that will be a conversation with Phil Mervis. And then just as I was kind of thinking about all of this, an email came through from Simon Sinek. And he said, and this is just so beautiful because it speaks to everything we're doing. He says, if you have the opportunity to do amazing things in your life, bring someone with you. So this afternoon, I regard the opportunity to have this conversation with Gary as an amazing thing in my life. And I am just so honored that 68 people showed up to be part of this conversation. We had 140 people register, but you know, it's online and all of that stuff.
Sorry, Louise, can I just use the opportunity to say there seems to be a few people in the waiting room who are asking to be let in.
Yes, I am immediately letting them in. Thank you very much for checking.
And if you want to make someone co-host, I would be happy to keep an eye on the waiting room as well.
Thank you. I will do that. Thanks for letting me know, and I have made you co-host. Thanks, Magli. So thank you for showing up, and now we've got 8 more people on the call. And I want to, without any further ado, I want to hand it over to Gary. And I think, Gary, the conversation that you and I started just while people were waiting in the waiting room earlier was just, why do you think that we need to reimagine leadership development, given the time that we live in right now, and given what you see at through your work at MSOD? And sorry, what I didn't mention is that Gary's also the chair, the international chair of the Organisational Development Network. So Gary, we'd love to hear some thoughts from you.
Gary,
sorry, Gary, you muted. I was muted when I said that to you.
There we go. Can you hear me now? Okay, great. Well, thank you all for being here. I really do appreciate your interest, and I do want to emphasize the conversation part of it so that we have a dialogue. It'll be much more interesting, I think, for all of you. We have a limited amount of time, so not really an opportunity to structure, experiences into it. So we'll make it a Socratic, kind of dialogical experience, if you will. I also want to thank those of you who have your camera on. It's much more interesting to actually talk to people's faces. So I appreciate that than those little black boxes we're seeing here these days on Zoom. Anyway, so kind of to your question, Louise, I would say I've thought we've needed to reimagine leadership for quite some time. In fact, a lot of my work goes there as academic chief and director for my area at the university. This is what I do, right? I'm the academic director in the business school. So I'm constantly thinking about, are we really, in fact, just teaching people how to make money, or are we preparing good citizens, leaders who can do good for the world, right? So what I would say is, I think we've known for a while, but it's really been accented by the last year, the COVID pandemic, the social unrest, specifically, here in the States, and it's tipping the iceberg of awareness for people at a level that's never been done before, at least, or it hasn't been done maybe in 50 years, I should say, here in the US. And it's heightened the sensitivity, I think, globally, right, of people to begin to think about things. And I guess I would offer that I think transformation is the new normal. People keep saying, what is the new normal? Are we going to go back to the new normal? And I think transformation is the new normal. And I think that's going to get even more so. not just because of the dynamics of things like the pandemic and social unrest and so forth, but also just the onset of what is being referred to as the smart machine age, or the fourth industrial revolution, right? The use of artificial intelligence and so forth, and the new kind of worker, right? The dispersed worker, and the independent contracting worker and so forth. How do you begin to facilitate all of that? It was very different when we were all in a box together doing stuff, right? But as Zoom and the internet and all the things we know expand our reach, the conventional ways that we've done leadership, I don't think will continue to apply. The second thing I would offer is that a lot of leadership has been describing what it is, and it has described the characteristics of leadership, and almost sort of the premise, if you will, that if someone can just understand the characteristics, or if they can understand the concepts like servant leadership, etc., then that knowledge will make them one. And I've increasingly become convinced we've made a lot of smart managers. We haven't necessarily cultivated a lot of effective leaders. And so for me, I think that's really the apex we're at right now. I think we have an opportunity to really look at, if we're going to create transformational leaders, if that's what we need to make happen, then we have to rethink the how, if you will. And that's what my work is doing right now, and I know a lot of people are in this space and so forth. I think that's what Partners for Possibility does. It meets a lot of that criteria or principles that's showing up in mine and other people's research about. So what is the new how, and how can we translate that into a practice that effectively leads to what we all keep expecting leaders to do, which is to lead transformation. I should say, for the purposes of our discussion today, that I do distinguish between leadership and management. They're used a lot interchangeably. I think management is about today. We've got to run an organization today. We have to, functionally carry out whatever it is our goals are and our objectives, and we have to manage to a budget, and we have to manage to our customers or constituents and so forth. To me, that is management. Leadership is about tomorrow. It's about what's coming. It's about how are we influencing a difference. And that is the distinction I make, so that from a definition or operational perspective, you understand how I'm referring to leadership. I know there's lots of different definitions. Because of the privilege of the positions I hold, I get invited a lot to speak to different corporations and that sort of thing. And for a long time, I found myself really frustrated, because what they did was called me in to be the keynote or the teaser to their leadership development program. And yet, so I would ask to spend the day, right? And as opposed to just go in and be the kickoff speaker, I'd ask to spend the day. And what I would see is these programs where they would bring through multiple C-level executives or project leaders or something like that, who would begin to tell people things about the company, or to be successful here, or I'm the CFO and how I became the CFO here is, etc. And I thought, oh, this is management orientation. And maybe we need to have a dialogue, and that's usually what I would resort to, is kind of ask them what's their intention as a leader, as opposed to what they need to know. And it always led to a lot of curiosity, right? So I think in some respects, not only have we not spent a lot of time on the how, do you be a transformational leader? Transformational meaning, how do you take it forward in a way that's significant and different than the past? But also that, there's a lot of folks who are, I think, very hungry. We haven't had these kinds of conversations in many respects. So that's kind of the context of the why I think it needs to happen.
And what we are, so thanks, Gary. So we're in agreement, and I was seeing lots of nods, lots of heads nodding. So I think there's a lot of agreement in this room. But so what have you seen then? What have you seen about the how? What examples have you seen of people taking, you know, these ideas that you're talking about and actually executing on them and doing things differently from having, so, you know, one of the frustrations I have when I was a business school professor and teaching on MBA, which I don't do anymore because I just got to a point where I didn't believe in that anymore, was how little things actually changed. So these MBA students would come, they'll go through a whole year, lots of book knowledge, lots of cognitive stuff. Julian Birkinshaw talks about MBAs being cognitive, behavioral, and affective. And we certainly didn't at the business schools where I taught. There wasn't enough. It was very cognitive. And so people were not really making any shifts in their leadership and how they showed up in the world as a result of doing these MBA programs. So what examples have you seen around how?
Yeah, well, certainly I think Partners for Possibility, but let me explain why. So I think one of the challenges is that we often do training, and again, this is not to sound critical, it's just a dialogue around how we can evolve training and so forth. We've often done it, again, about what we've known. And I think the leader's role, having served as a CEO or a senior executive in some fairly large companies and so forth myself, it's learning how to deal with the unknown that is the leadership's task, right? What is known can be managed by different persons, but the person in managerial leadership roles is faced with kind of going forward into a future. Well, we don't know the future, so how do we begin to craft that, right? So I think part of it is beginning to ask them their intention, much like you started off this call. Why are you here? I think unless the launch, the sensitivity of the initial relationship is based on what's meaningful for you to be here, then we put them in the position of being a passive recipient. And I think they have to first work through this notion of what's the intrinsic value for them? What's touching them? Why do they want to pursue leadership? What's the meaning for them? And I say that because when we lead change, all of us who have ever been involved in a transformation project, right, or led change in an organization, small, large, social, whatever, we know that to create transformation, we have to make it personal, right? All organizational changes we've learned over the years and by our mentors is preceded by an individual choosing to change, right? At the end of the day, what I share with my leaders, at the end of the day, you manage a business plan, you manage a P&L, you manage, et cetera, but you lead people. And so how are you elevating the human side of the enterprise as being central, first and foremost, to your decision making? Because if you're not doing that, then quite honestly, you're just highly paid overhead, right, to move the chess pieces. And so to earn your keep as leader, we need to talk about how do we unleash your ability to be influential, to be relational. And not just with external stakeholders, certainly that's an important group, but even with them, right? How do you change the dialogue so that they have a broader sense of what the organization can contribute to the world? So I think, helping them to get clear on their intention of why they're there, it has to be the first and foremost thing. So we do that, as I said, in transformation work, right? And we also know some fundamentals of transformational work, and that is that it needs to take place in situ. In other words, it needs to take place in and with the people. You can't do it from the outside. If you do it from the outside, that's colonialism, right? That's command and control. So you can only do it by going into the system, understanding it, helping communities or organizations understand what it is they want, right? What's their intention? What will be meaningful to them? And also bearing in mind that as we attend to, our work in change leadership in OD is always about closing the gap between what is and what our intentions are, right? So that now tells us the work. So if we go in ahead of time to prescribe with what we want to have happen, then we've assumed we know the gap, as opposed to having the gap emerge from people. So if we begin to take the principles of OD, leadership, creating change and so forth, then we can see that these principles pretty much play themselves out in the same way. So I start with leaders with, the first session or initial work being, what do you want, right? What's meaningful to you? What's your intention? And then how's that different than the way you are today? So that we begin to discover the gap. The other covert process that I realize is always happening in all transformation work is that there will be a loss involved. In order to move to a new point, we have to give up the old point. And there's a novelty there. We have all kinds of models that tell us about navigating that novelty and so forth. But if any of us have ever tried to change just a personal habit, right? We know how hard that is, even with the best of knowledge, best of information, right? If we look in the healthcare field, which was my executive background before I moved into being in the university, we would have patients come in who are near death's door due to illness that resulted from lifestyle behaviors, massive heart attacks, for example. And, they managed through medicine to get healthy, survive the first, few days. We'd have educational people come in, nutritional people come in, therapists come in, and so forth. And within 6 weeks, the vast majority, I forget what the number is, I haven't read the research in a while, but the vast majority will resume the lifestyle they had that led to the heart attack, right? Despite having come close to death's door. So that tells us that our mental models, our cultural training, our way of believing how the world works is so embedded that we need to disrupt that thinking, and we need to disrupt it for a period of time sufficient to begin, as we're learning from neuroscience, to rewire the brain, get new practices, and those practices become the new habit and so forth. But it does mean giving up something. And so we seldom begin to talk about loss, right, as a leader. All right, you're a leader who wants to be transformational. What does that mean you're giving up? What are you losing? Well, maybe I used to be known as the leader who hit all my milestones, no matter what, I got it done or whatever. And I'm not sure I can do that in this new style and so forth. Okay, now we're talking about something. You've got fear. Let's start talking about your fears around this kind of stuff, etc. So again, I'm being probably a bit wordy, but the idea is to surface their intention and then begin to look at that intention as a path of transformation. And understand that all transformation, ergo all transformational learning, really happens kind of in situ, in other words, situated learning. That's what I think is so brilliant about Partners for Possibility, right? We don't go into an organization's executive office and say, here, let me help you understand what we need to do to begin a new dialogue about race relations and caring about your own local neighborhood and so on and so forth. That will, I won't say it'll fall on deaf ears, but it'll be one of a million pitches that they're getting about needs on a social level. But to take them out of their office, to put them in a situation and then process that experience, what's surfacing for them, that now begins to surface what we know are sort of their inner dynamics, if you will. And leadership development, I believe, has to ultimately do that, or we fail leaders in terms of understanding what it takes for the people that they're choosing to lead to go through change and transformation. So they have nothing new in the way of tools, so they will resort eventually to command and control, even if it's under the auspices of some very clever tools.
So thanks, Gary. That's a great lead into this conversation around, so one of the things that we've loved as we've got people from other parts of the world look into the work that we're doing in South Africa is just, what are you seeing that we might not be able to see? So one of the things that we've been so surprised by is when we I'm going to take Grant, because Grant's sitting right in front of me. Sorry, Grant, I always pick on you, don't I? Anyway, we take Grant. Grant in NetBank is an important guy. I've recently seen how people respond to Grant's going to be a speaker. So suddenly people show up because, he's got a name. He's in this executive office. So now we take him to a school where no one got the memo that Grant's a really important guy. They didn't get that memo. So they don't treat him any differently than they would anybody else. Actually, they're a bit wary. They think, who's this white guy who's showing up here at our school and what is he trying to tell us and sell us? And so they treat him maybe with a bit more caution that he would normally be treated. And then we give Grant and his partner an impossible task. We say, mobilize active citizenship around the school, strengthen leadership capacity, and ultimately improve education outcomes. Which because you've been involved in education for a long time, know that that's kind of pretty much an impossible task. And if Grant for a moment thought that he knew how to do that, then he's as delusional as your president is, by the way. Sorry, Gary, but honestly, this must be hard for you to see what's going on in your country. So luckily we've got a whole support structure and we help Grant to kind of not be delusional, not to act as if he's delusional. We throw him into the deep end. We take him through a theory U process to say, please, whatever you do, don't do anything until you understand the situation. And then, and then he develops new insights. He learns how to take people along on a journey. He discovers that the world and community doesn't work the same way that it does in NetBank because Grant said so, everybody does. That just doesn't work that way. So, and that's where I think that's where Phil's point around, that's how we're going to develop this leaders for the new world that we're living is if we're going to give them opportunities to really experience the majority, the world that the majority of people live in rather than the few who are in the executive office at a large corporate. So Gary, from an organizational development perspective and obviously from your role at the MSOD, could you help just for the people who've been involved in this program, and what are you noticing that we might not be able to notice, or what are you seeing that excites you from OD and leadership development perspective?
Well, I don't know that I am seeing anything different than you are. I certainly am processing it the way I do process, right? And I do work in multiple countries, and I again get the opportunity to work with a lot of different cultures. In fact, we just worked with 5 companies in South Africa. When we couldn't come there in person, we tried it virtually, and very fascinating. I think, putting a grant, sorry to use you as an object there, Grant, but, when we put a grant into a new situation, again, I think that's situated learning. What we're hoping is not that Grant figures out from his past experience how to accomplish this impossible task, right? That would be asking him to be the savior. And again, that goes back to conquering, right? We're going to take the expertise from here and we're going to make sure these people who are less fortunate get it. And I'm not sure that should be the goal of situated learning. I think situated learning needs to create cognitive dissonance for everyone. So if someone's saying, who is this person, right? Then Grant, or the grants, if you will, in the world need to be saying, who are these people? And then what do we have in common together? What can we learn to do together, right? I think curiosity is a far more powerful tool than opinions and expertise ever will be. We need opinions and expertise because we need some kind of direction, but part of getting clear on your intention is getting clear on what do we want from each other, right? If we keep doing the same thing, we're essentially telling leaders we want them to be, imperial controllers, right? The corporate system is predicated on the agricultural system, which is predicated on the landowner system, which is predicated on the aristocracy. It is structured to be oppressive. And so in order to shift those dynamics, we have to begin thinking not about a form of government necessarily. I'm not advocating that we give up capitalism for socialism or any of that sort of thing. I don't care to get involved in that. What I do care to say is, how are you, executive or anyone really who chooses to be in a leadership role, cognizant of the communal experience going on around you, right? I think corporate social responsibility is an interesting phenomenon that the company has to hire someone to run a department or a program for the company to go be socially responsible. That to me is quite honestly very, I don't want to sound pejorative, so I probably should stop there. But anyway, I just don't see it as the method. I think, well, this company is in a neighborhood, right? Or exists in a town, it exists in a city. What does it know about those people, right? And it doesn't matter if it has worldwide reach in its distribution, it should also have local consciousness, right? So if you are operating, you know, over on Main Street and over on 6th Street, you've got an extraordinarily impoverished area, then how are you viewing that area? Are you viewing it as less than, as not a resource? Are you, you know, standing in some kind of judgment? Or do you think it needs to be fixed? Or do you think it's part of your community that perhaps has gifts that if you spent time with that community and you did development work within that community and you shared a mutual experience of learning together within that community, you might discover possibilities that that you wouldn't have otherwise, right? So I take people into situated learning. I take, for example, there's Huletta Broomfield's on the call here. I see Huletta there, wave. And Huletta, when I go to Costa Rica with folks a couple times a year, and we partner up with Huletta and some other folks there, and we take our grad students, right? And people say, well, let's do an international session. Well, most international sessions means we go somewhere in a typical university and people come in and talk, right? We bring in the finance minister, corporate leaders, and so on and so forth. Well, that doesn't tell us anything about being a global practitioner. So instead, we take our grad students, what we've structured, we take them into this barrio. It's called La Carpia. And La Carpia is a kind of, for lack of a better way to put it, a refugee center for people from other Central American countries who have made their way without legal sanctioning into this community that they have self-organized and built over the years, that is in a piece of land nobody cares about in Costa Rica because it is the Isthmus Peninsula that goes into the national dump. And so, you know, no one else will live there, but these people have taken that piece of land and they've turned it into their town. And it's got, you know, reputation of being dangerous. It's got a reputation of all these different kinds of things and so forth. But we go there and we discover what it's like to live there. And we discover entrepreneurs and we discover, you know, the abuelos, the grandmothers, and the traditions that they're passing along. And we discover the fellows who decide to create soccer leagues with the kids. And we begin to discover the gifts there. Now, it's not just us discovering their gifts. It's also a chance to create what I was saying about that cognitive dissonance, because when I ask the executives we take into this setting in a debriefing experience using an ODate technique like Open Space or World Cafe, what they experience, they invariably have an experience of they were surprised, they noticed the poverty, they noticed the pollution, you know, and they feel terrible about the change in economics. And then pretty soon it all becomes about their story, right? And so I say, well, okay, let's confront that. So we have a dialogue, a very harsh, not harsh, but intense, better word, dialogue around the projections they've just made, right? And I say, now let's go back And so we go back after having this deep, intensive processing, and they begin to get a glimpse of this area as not a place to be pitied, but as a community to be supported like every community. And so what would that mean, and how would those dialogues bring that about? So again, it's the opportunity to create an in situ situation, right? Try to remove the oppressive structure that's already in place to recapitulate hierarchy and dominance and so forth, and then begin to be present enough as change agents, as people doing leadership development, to surface the gap between our understanding and what we intend, and then process that work in such a way that it creates a cognitive dissonance, and then ask the provocative questions. Like, why does corporate social responsibility have to be a department? Why isn't it a part of the philosophy? Why isn't it a part of just the way you think about approaching business? And again, it goes with social organizing as well. Now I've got more stories, but I'll just stop there. I think I've conveyed the principle and just open it up.
I'm conscious of the fact that we have lots of people on the call who I'm sure have questions, and Grant has just done us the honor to open his mic. And so over to you, Grant. And if anybody else has a question that they want to ask Gary, please let me know. Grant?
Thanks, Louise. Hoping I'm not jumping the gun. Thank you, Gary. This was amazing and very, very insightful. If you were trying to create the consciousness amongst a executive management community that was fundamentally stuck in a management mentality, how would you go about helping them do a transition to leadership? Because in a South African context, we obviously had legislative racism up until 25 years ago. We now live in the world's most unequal society on earth, with perverse levels of inequality, which are fundamentally premised and driven by race. And yet our corporate landscape is, this is okay, you know, we're on track with, you know, we must do some more BE schemes, you know. And it's not, we're not seeing leaders lead for social justice, for inclusion, for equality, you know, all of those things. How would you steer an entrenched management team to start that process, that journey?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, I think we need to think of it as what's the processes that if we put in place would begin to create that shift, as opposed to treating it like an event. I think you may have multiple events along the way, but what is the process you could launch, right? It's kind of like a strategic planning process. What's a process you could launch that would increase your cognizance of what's going on around you? And then, so I think when you begin to think that way, you have to start with the outcome. So when I work with leaders, and I have done this, I'm not just talking from an academic tower. As Louise knows, I was very fortunate, you know, back around 2004, to begin to partner with some folks here who wanted to create an alternative early learning system, because only, you know, kind of middle class and upper middle class kids really get to go to preschool in the US, and that puts them behind because, you know, middle class and upper middle class get to go and so on and so forth, right? So we've got this system that automatically disenfranchises an enormous amount of children. And when we look at the cities, major cities, somewhere in the neighborhood of 50% of the kids do not finish school on time, right? And this is in the US, which, you know, claims this huge, incredible system. And we pay taxes, so why should we have to do anything else, right? You know, that kind of thing. So eventually, it's not enough for me to see them as an other. I have to first take away the otherness, right? If I create it as an other, then it quickly can become or be perceived or experienced as a burden. So I try to, again, make it very personal, very, very personal. So when we started this system, literally on the back of a napkin, we didn't quite know where we were going. And we just know we wanted to create this alternative to the federally funded programs. Not that the federally funded programs are bad, but they don't necessarily position kids to be competitive. So we thought, well, we've got to replicate this private sector competitive system in a way that gives, I don't mean competitive against each other, I mean to make them eventually, able to get jobs and finish school and that kind of stuff. We've got to create that in a way that's accessible to these kids who don't have it, right? And so when we started off, everybody wanted to create a program for poor kids. And I remember sitting in a meeting and saying, that is the wrong question, right? Because if we create a system for poor kids or kids at risk or kids that are disenfranchised or minority children and so on and so forth, we have automatically created the other, and we will build that into our mental model. And so and that will influence the way we approach this task. So these are children. So when we have conversations with executives, right, when we went out to say to executives, okay, how can you participate, get involved, and so on and so forth, for me to go out and say, these children are in need and so on, they already know that. Their social and collective denial has already said, these are marginalized kids. We've come up with labels, et cetera, to make it easy not to pay attention to that segment of society, except for through paying taxes and special social programs. So instead, I got the Federal Reserve involved. I got the Rand Institute involved. I got a few universities involved. And we began to try to create language or principles, our principles in their language, so that we had a dialogue with them that was very personal and one they could understand. So instead of, come participate in this and see how you can help, I started saying things like, how many of you are interested in investments? Everybody in the room's hand would go up. And I said, well, what if I told you that you could take your reserves and you could do an investment and you could get a $17 return on every dollar you invested? Everybody's hands would go up, right? They're interested in that kind of ROI and so on and so forth. And then I would say, well, listen, not my bleeding heart liberal proposition. Let's look at the Federal Reserve's research. Let's look at the Rand Institute. Let's look at some of these, very highly regarded universities. And here's what they're saying, right? And then I would say, so, gee, where do you live? And they might say, well, I live, in Culver City. In Culver City. Do you know that less than 8 miles away from you, there are children who will go to bed hungry tonight? Their one meal was at school if they were lucky, if they were old enough to go to school. Many of those kids took a meal home to split it with younger kids, and I'll sort of paint the picture of the local. And then I'll say, do these children deserve what your children get? That's all I want to know, because, and they, typically they'll try to evade the answer and so forth. And I'll say, no. I'm not here to judge. You're free to say no, but just own it, right? So I try to create a cognitive dissonance and a dismissing of this concept of other, because whether there's an other race or an other economic or any way that we could classify it, those are classification schemes that allow me to depersonalize. So when I work with executives or a management group, I try to make it very personal. Why should you care, right? Let's just take a look, and why don't you care? If you say you want a better world for everybody, then what does that mean? Let's just get it out on the table. Let's have some heart to heart. I'm not going to judge you. You're free. You're an agent of your own life, but let's call it what it is and let's have the conversation. Otherwise, we're wasting our time. I don't want to convince you. I want to invite you. And I can only invite you if I can make it, again, meaningful. So try to start with that. What's the invitation that will be meaningful, that will have resonance? and start with those that are willing. Because I think your programs, any initiatives, including leadership and development training, will be far more successful when it's a system of attraction as opposed to compulsion. In other words, if I make it a compulsory thing, I've already probably lost. I'm at a disadvantage. And so the question becomes, you know, how am I making this attractive to people? So just to give you an example of where we went with that system, we went from the back of a napkin to having raised $750 million and building 350 urban schools in 5.5 years, serving 50,000 children. Now that's a performance I would put up against any private industry, right? But we did so by building a system of traction that pretty soon people were saying, yeah, I get it. I want to be a part of that, and so on and so forth. It is perseverance as well. I don't want to minimize that. You cannot create a one and done leadership development training. That's not development. That's a leadership event or an informational event. It's about a developmental process, building capacity, right? That's what OD does. That's what I think all L&D should do. You know, continue to create this capacity or capability. If people could do it, were inclined to do it, or sensitive to do it, they would have done it already. So we need to understand there's a gap right there in the beginning for us to begin to close. I'm noticing some interesting things in the chat. I'm sorry, I get distracted a little bit when these little things pop up. But one says, what invitation is needed? The win for all? That's an interesting way to put it. I don't know who R. Lightning is.
Renee Lightning.
Huh?
Renee.
Renee. Hi, Renee. You know, personally, I think that would be kind of a nice thing, right? If we had a win for all, but that may not have meaning. So I may, in fact, say, here's what we're about. What is it about this, whatever this is, that has meaning for you, right? So I always turn the invitation partially into a question. You know, what would be meaningful for you to be here? I do that with my graduate students. I did it with my, executives. We used to have these calls. All of you have been involved in corporate life know you have these monthly financial reviews and performance reviews and that sort of stuff. And I used to say to my executives, why are you here? Are we just going to exchange a bunch of information that's 6 weeks old, or are we going to talk about what you're going to do? What's exciting, what's promising, what's possible, how you're, facilitating your associates to perform in some way. So again, create a question in the invitation, because a question that people can't escape will cause them to think. And they may not bite right then and there, they may not step in right then and there, but we know from the principle of simultaneity that if you can provocatively plant a seed enough, even if you're not around to see it grow, they can't unlearn it. But you can't.
So Gary, we're coming to the end of our time together, which is just way too short. I do want to leave a little bit of time right at the end for anybody who wants to just appreciate you. There's a question from Kamala about how do you measure the success of a leadership development intervention, which you and I spoke briefly about before. And then I also want you to just spend a few more minutes. I remember the first time I had a conversation with Phil, we were sitting under an oak tree at a wine farm, and he was telling me why he thought Partners Possibility is a special intervention because of a whole bunch of things. And so we also want to give you the opportunity to just say those words. You gave us a beautiful endorsement for the book, but what is about Partners Possibility that you are excited about? That's the first question. And the second, or maybe that's the last question. And the question before that is, how would you evaluate? Because obviously many of our funders want to know have you been able to improve the grade 3 literacy results? And if you have, then we will fund you. And if not, then we're not interested. When, we have 2,300 stories of people whose lives have been changed as a result of PFP.
Yeah, so that's always an interesting question, right? How do you measure the success or the benefit of a social intervention or, even leadership and development within an organization. Internal people are constantly trying to figure out how to, promote their worthiness and so forth. If it's me involved, I tend to confront that as another other. It's like, but I realize that's, to some extent my privilege because of the position I hold. So I can just tell executives, well, that's a stupid question. And let's move on to what you really want to know. And that's, why should you spend your time and effort in this area? That's really your question. Let's get to that. But I realize not everybody can do that. So my typical response, and the one I encourage the strongest, is, what's the leap of faith you're willing to take until you can learn what the ROI is? Because you can't expect on the onset what really is the outcome. It just won't happen. So we need to move away from the outcome conversation and say, we'll get there, but what's the leap of faith you're willing to take while we're on our way there? And people say, well, they'll reject that, or they'll reject that. If they reject even engaging in that conversation, then they're not willing to be a partner in the first place. So don't waste your time, right? Figure out another way to frame it up in language that they will. Understand your mountain to climb is going to be much more incremental than someone else's. But start with the conversation, right, that does begin to invite them into the unknown, right? That says this is going to take a leap of faith. Now, maybe part of what they'll hear is a willingness to look at impact outcomes, as opposed to, investment outcomes. So, all right, well, we will impact 400 lives in the next and here's the logic model we're following as to where the impact of those 400 lives can go. And so we'll, let's craft impact outcomes as opposed to, some kind of quantitative measurement that's really, perhaps irrelevant, or that promises something we don't know we can deliver. But I think that conversation alone can't just take place by itself. I think there are really 6 principles, if I can share. This is a little preview on some of my research that I'm putting out, but I'll go ahead and share it with you, is that what we know is that we have to find unity in some fashion. So if they're asking me the ROI question, then they're asking me about something that they have some kind of investment in, right? Or they wouldn't be now talking to me about the outcome. So again, I want to look for what's common as opposed to just respond and react, right? So if I can find that common unity, that's one principle. The second is I need to be willing, as the leadership developer, facilitator, change leader, whatever role I'm playing, even executive actually, to be responsive to emerging dynamics. So I can't just create a proposition and expect them to buy off or not buy off. I need to think about, so what am I doing to help them buy off, right? If I know I need a decision by December, what can I do, October 20th that will help them begin to think differently? And so how do we have a conversation before the conversation of ROI and outcomes and so forth that begins to cue up what we're trying to discuss? And understand that through the entire process, people will be surfacing sentiments. And so I need to be responsive to those sentiments, right? Because if it creates distress, then I need to support that distress. If it creates curiosity, I need to support that curiosity, right? So cognitive dissonance is going to yield something. I need to be responsive to what it's yielding. The third is that no matter how well I've planned it, it's like in the words of Diana Whitney, for those of you who studied appreciative inquiry, right? She used to say, plan tight and hang loose. Right. So I need to recognize that emergence will occur. It's not a static world. Right. I think this is even trouble within organizations where we come up with a business plan and then we just keep measuring how we're doing against a business plan we created a year ago, as opposed to constantly reformulating it in light of emergence. But emergence will occur. The fourth is that context is crucial. You know, what I do in one setting, I cannot just replicate it in another setting. It may be a reference point for me, but my past success guarantees me nothing in the future. It only means I have some information to carry into a new situation, into a new future. Now I need to have the dialogue in that new context that is relevant, meaningful, and meets all the other things that I've been saying and so forth. And then I also need to understand that meaningful dialogue cannot be replaced. It can't be replaced through memos. It can't be replaced through program descriptions or any of that sort of stuff. All that stuff is necessary, but dialogue ultimately has to happen because we have to co-create meaning. See, underlying true transformation is we've co-created a meaning about a new future that is more desirable than the one we're in. And as leaders, that's what they're supposed to be doing, right? Constantly evolving, meeting the future, meeting the external world and what it needs and so forth. And then the sixth one, I think, or the fifth one, where are we at? I don't think oh, yeah.
I've given us the fifth, it's now the sixth.
Oh, so the sixth. Yeah, so this is the one that's the most difficult, but I have to support people being willing to lean into possibilities. So I have to have a dialogue about leaning into possibilities. That's what I love about the name of your program, by the way, is I have to help people lean into possibilities about something they've had no experience in, right? And that's like asking them to jump off a cliff. So I need to have those kinds of dialogues that say, well, here's a possibility. What does that possibility mean to you, et cetera? So I think those 6 principles I have found when they underlie the team leader, the trainer, the facilitator, the OD consultant's mental model, right? And we use empathy and curiosity with the very people we're trying to train so that we don't end up treating them as other, right? I think that's one of the things that plagues the OD and, you know, change leadership field is we want to be counter dependent to these evil executives, right? Who have dominated and taken too much money and so on and so forth. Well, we've just made them the other, right? So we're going to create counter oppressive programs, and you know, that's not going to be what leads us into the future. So anyway, I think there was one other question. I'm sorry.
The other question is the one that we're all waiting anxiously to hear, Gary. Why were you inspired by Partners for Possibility as a program? Just so that we can get that little snippet from you.
Yeah, well, I think it is just what I've been talking about, right? It is an invitation to partner in something that nobody knows what the outcome will necessarily be today. But what we do know is there is a logic model that's grounded in science. It's grounded in research, right? It's grounded in you know, everything you would want something to be, right? It's now on the cutting edge, right? So I think it's a brilliant question to ask an executive. Do you want to be on the cutting edge of something new, knowing that you're going to go into it with some unknowns? And, you know, if you're an entrepreneur or a true leader, you will be interested in the future. And I think that's what Partners for Possibilities does. The other thing is the experience of a week in a school doesn't stop the program, right? So there's a process of ongoing support in learning your coaches, the stuff I read about, the stories, and not just the stories of the executives that go through, but the people who are facilitating, what they learned from it, what emerged for them, right? Because, you know, just in closing, I think creating common understanding breeds empathy. And without empathy, we will not take any steps towards making something different. And I think that it's just a brilliant model because it does that and it has those conversations. So, you know, I've always loved supporting your work, Louise, and to see a bunch of folks who say, okay, well, let's just give it a go. Let's give it a try. Let's see what starts to happen and build the bridge as we're walking on it means you, in fact, are charting new territory. So anyway, hope that helps.
Thank you so much, Gary. We will, so partly one of the invitations from us as a community is, please can you bring the MSOD students to South Africa? We will create an amazing learning opportunity for them to have an immersive experience in a school across South Africa. We're working in 1,350 schools now, so that's one invitation. Gary and I are lucky. We're having another conversation an hour from now with Peter Block's community, because we are both involved in setting up a series of masterclasses with Peter. So you will get an opportunity to see Gary again somewhere in the future. I've put a link into the chat function. If you are willing to give us some feedback, we would love to get your feedback. We are having the conversation next week with Julian. I'm hoping we can set up a conversation with Phil as we are reimagining leadership development. So I see lots of thanks here in the chat from our community. Gary, I do want to get Corin. We just need to hear some voices. Gary just said you cannot replace meaningful dialogue. So we want to hear 3 people on the call who want to say with words, what did you take away from today? Or why are you leaving in a better place than you were when you started? So I'm going to put Corin on the spot as a starting point, and then Corin.
Thank you, Louise. Gary, what an invigorating, exciting conversation to engage in, and specific, so many things, but just so loudly, that invitational space that you create, and in particular, what is meaningful for you. Yeah, I loved it, and the emphasis of dialogue, one conversation at a time. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. I'm glad something was supportive.
Thank you, Karen. Anybody else from our community you want to say thank you to Gary? Watching people's...
Rather than a thank you, just anything you're walking away with.
Anything that you want to say.
Significant.
Final thoughts to Gary.
Yeah, if I may.
Yes.
Just very much what Karen said, the invitational process, rather than here's the input, this is what you need to be a leader, and read this and you'll be the right leader in 2 days' time, is the journey that you're inviting people to engage with, whether you're leading a small company, leading a family, or engaging corporates into an organization. It's all that idea is transformational in itself, and I'm very excited about it. So thank you very much. Thanks for your time. Thanks for setting up, Louise, and thanks for the invitation.
Thank you, Ian. I see Justin is putting his hand up to me, and then let's hear from Tony, and then Justin, and then I think we're gonna end the call. So Tony, Justin, you will have the last word.
Well, I was actually greeting somebody that just walked in, Louise, but my hand, but I'd love to say something anyway. So
let's hear from Tony, and then we'll hear from you, Justin. Tony.
Okay.
Thanks, guys. I think it's great to really have this interaction, and I'll just maybe ask a question. You know, it would really be of great value to see these kind of conversations propagate and find a way of. Are there people that are wanting to continue the conversation? Is there a forum that we can say, guys, listen, let's just meet on a private chat, you know, next week, whatever it is, that people who want to bring this further, it'd be great to just, you know, it's so encouraging to see so many faces, so many people nodding their heads, so many people engaged. But, you know, I feel often this whole opportunity is there, but it kind of not lost, but it sort of, it needs another.
So Tony, we are definitely, this is a start of a conversation. We had the first conversation last Wednesday where Grant and a few other people participated. Today is our second conversation. Next Monday, we're having another one. We'll talk to Phil. We are setting up a conversation between practitioners to say, how do we rethink leadership development? And for me, how can South Africa be a leader on this journey rather than continuously? I mean, in the past, we used to follow. We used to bring the gurus to South Africa, and then I think South Africa has something to offer to the world. So I'm having a conversation with Jonathan Jansen later this week about, because everybody's telling me at the moment that because I've left my job as PFP program director, I should now go to Harvard and I should go to Stanford, I'm going, no. I'd far rather do something in South Africa. So I'm having a conversation with Professor Janssen. We are going to reimagine how to do these kind of things in South Africa, for South Africa, and then for the world. So I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to give Justin the last word, and then Gary, maybe Gary, the final word. Justin.
Thanks, Louise, and thank you, Gary. What's really emerging for me and it's around language, is how language in leadership development is evolving, and how the language of convening an invitation is becoming so significant. And it's come through very clearly in your talk today. And what's occurring to me is these formerly disparate elements of society, faith-based organizations, spiritual growth, leadership, management, are all starting to convene in this wonderful center, where we're starting to understand that again, previously disparate parts of our being are housed under the same roof. And it's starting to vibrate with this wonderful energy that kind of dispels all of the 6 steps to highly effective leadership and the 8 habits of what, and it's come through so clearly in your language today. So I really just wanted to thank you for that, for the intentionality that you've brought to this, of using language that we can all use and we can all start picking up on. So thanks, Gary.
Thank you, everybody. We will, sorry, Gary, last word from you.
Yeah, no, thank you all. I appreciate it. I'm delighted if you take something away from this morning, this conversation. Wish we had more time. So I think that must mean there's an invitation to come to South Africa at some point, maybe. No, I'd love to. But I think, again, Tony got it right? How do you keep the conversation going? That's really the underpinning of this whole principle. Transformation is a process. And so how do we keep it going as disruptive, as uncomfortable? And how do we make sure we're uncomfortable having the conversations? Because if we're not uncomfortable having the conversation, we're not paying attention. It means we're in our comfort zone as opposed to stepping out of it when we ask other people to step out of theirs, because that will be the art of the shift. So anyway, really appreciate you people taking time out of your schedule to be with me, and again, very humbled, and thank you, Louise. I appreciate that you're out there in the world making these conversations happen.
So I just want to say to those of you working in corporates, I can't afford to bring Gary to South Africa, but you might, and then we'll all piggyback on you bringing Gary to South Africa.
Great plan.
So
great plan.
Be in touch if you want to make that happen, and have a wonderful evening, and hopefully we'll see you next Monday afternoon for a conversation with Julian, which will be very different. And then Phil, we're not letting you off the hook. We definitely want to be in a conversation with you as well. So thank you very much, everybody.
Be sure to show up for Phil. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Take care.